Welcome to the Next Level Human podcast. As a human, you have a job to do. In fact, you have 4 jobs: to earn and manage money, to attain and maintain health and fitness, to build and sustain personal relationships, to find meaning and make a difference. None of these jobs are taught in school, and that is what this podcast is designed to do: to educate us all on living our most fulfilled lives through the mastery of these 4 jobs. I'm your host, Dr. Jade, Teta, and I believe we are here living this life for 3 reasons, and 3 reasons only: to learn, to teach, and to love. In this podcast, I will be learning, teaching, and loving right along with you. I'm grateful to have your company. Here's to our next level. Welcome to the show, everybody. Today I'm here with my boy Justin Janoska. He actually came down to Asheville. We've been spending a week together, and so we're going to be on the podcast together. And I'm going to frame this up, and then Justin and I are both going to jump in. And part of the reason that part of the topic for this podcast is a conversation Justin and I were having about trauma and adjusting to trauma and some of the issues around trauma. And first thing I'll say as we get into this discussion is, I don't know, I know Justin sees it a little different, and maybe you can riff on this too, Justin, and give your take, but I really don't like the word trauma a lot. And the reason I don't is because it's vague, it's a little too broad, and it encapsulates a lot of stuff, right? So it forces us to have to go, all right, what are we talking about? Are we talking about capital T traumas like rape, physical abuse, those kinds of things? Or are we talking about little t traumas like a mother who was emotionally unstable, right? And so that's one of the reasons I don't love trauma, because, the idea is people go, well, I don't have trauma, because they don't see it as when we are developing that we develop certain adaptation behaviors that may or may not be adaptive and can be maladaptive based on how we perceive how we are interacting with the environment. As an example, let's say you're a child, you're a toddler. We know that we don't really start forming full memories until 4 to 6 years old. So any memories you have at that time are going to be fragmented in general. You're basically a ball of sensations. And let's say you're crying because you need to use the bathroom, or you're hungry, or whatever reason, and you're neglected. And by neglected, I mean, let's say your parents are busy, or they had to come from the parenting style of just let your child cry it out, etc. Now, for some children, that's going to be no big deal, right? Like, they do cry it out and they're fine. And for other humans or other children, that's going to be a traumatic event that then becomes a maladaptive response later. And the truth is, we don't know yet how impactful this is. And so in the work that you and I do, Justin, oftentimes people will just assume that any of this stuff is always a trauma. And I go, I don't know that it is. And I don't know that we actually know who falls prey to this stuff or not. And so this is part of what I wanted to talk about with you. So why don't we just get your take on this? First of all, what's your take on trauma? We talk about it a lot. And a part of the thing that we were talking about before we came on live is this idea that in the trauma space, all of a sudden, everything seems to be a trauma. And I don't think that we're allowing for the fact that some people aren't traumatized by this stuff. Some people become resilient from their traumas. They don't have negative adaptations. And so how do we really start to define this? And do you think it's wise that in the trauma space now, everything is considered, quote, trauma? So what should we be looking at, really?
It's really interesting. I know, because you pointed this out, and actually I agree. I didn't really notice it before about the overuse of the term and how kind of labeling everything as traumatic, and that can be really dangerous, right? Because seemingly innocuous things may not really be traumatic at all. But, and I think that's more from the therapy world and people who are professionals in that. They're maybe kind of doing that. But it's, by the same token, there are people that I work with who often have that argument that I didn't have trauma, I had a great childhood, my parents were amazing. And a lot of times that can be true, but a lot of times it's not, because again, we don't have a good understanding of what trauma is. And I just kind of think it's just a psychic wound, right? And anything, it's, has its own flavor, its own texture, its own color, and it's completely unique to you, and you don't really get to choose if something's traumatic or not. That's what I've kind of gathered and learned. And I think, again, depending on the age, if you're a young kid, 3 or 4 years old, you don't really get to choose, right? Your nervous system kind of decides for you, right? But as you mature and become an older adult, there's more resiliency. There's more, your brain has developed more, of course, more maturity. So you kind of, it's a different perspective. You actually have more agency, I think, and control over the situation. But one thing I was thinking about when you were talking, Jade, was how one question I ask clients, and I'll pose this to the audience, is if you're kind of in this camp of I didn't have trauma, and you kind of stand by that, that's fine. But one of the great questions I like to ask is, well, what's your stance with your parents or parent now? Like, what is your relationship with them like now? And you often find that I find that people have different opinions. Like, they may have had a defensive stance before. Now they're like, oh, now it's a little different, because they're kind of opening up the doors to a truth that they've kind of maybe ignored, and realize, oh yeah, my mom or dad is still kind of a narcissist or abusive or neglectful, or, that sort of thing. And it doesn't mean that you have trauma from that, but it just means that or something you haven't resolved, but it just means that there might be something to look deeply at and look more closely with an open mind.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And I actually think that maybe, at least when I do my work, like, the stuff with the journey and the awakening and the next level human stuff, I talk about it just as suffering and wounds. And so I like when you said just a psychic wound. I actually try to steer away from the term trauma because of the connotation behind it. And I also don't like that, people try to go, everyone's got trauma. I do think everyone has suffering, and I think everyone has been wounded. That's, the Buddhists talk about this a lot, right? They talk about the first principle of Buddhism really is this idea that life is trauma or life is dukkha. But really it's not trauma. What they're saying is life is suffering. Life is difficult. Life is unsatisfactory is really what they're saying. And then I go, well, isn't it kind of tough? I mean, like, the placebo effect, the belief effect is incredibly powerful. And so if we as individuals or as professionals are telling people they have trauma, right? Maybe maybe a better approach is to essentially say, we all suffer. You have suffered. I'll acknowledge that. And we need to acknowledge that we suffer and that you've suffered. And then based on that, we can also say, and we get to decide and choose what our suffering means. And I think that when we use the term trauma, we miss that whole point, that we actually get to choose what that means. Trauma has this idea that I've been scarred forever. It's irreversible from my perspective. Whereas suffering just goes, yeah, life's difficult. I've been through some shit in my life, but I get to choose how that is defined. And I'll tell you a very disturbing story. I don't think I've told you this, Justin, but I do talk about it often. This might be the first time I've mentioned it on the podcast. It's a very disturbing story that my mom told me that she actually didn't find disturbing. It happened to her, but it bothers me more than it bothers her. And here's the story. So when my mom was 15, 16 years old, if I told you the story about her grandfather. So when my mom was 15, 16 years old, they went to stay at her grandparents' home with her mom and her family. And my mom was changing in her room, 15, 16-year-old girl, and her grandfather walks in. She's shirtless, walks up behind her and cups her breasts, right, and starts rubbing her breasts. So my mom here has her grandfather doing this to her, and she's uncomfortable and just like, what the fuck? And then he basically stops and leaves the room. And so my mom goes to her mother, who my mom has a very significant mother wound, but goes to her mother and tells her what happened. And her mother very dismissively goes, he's such a dirty old man, just ignore him. And if it happens again, tell me. And kind of just didn't make a big deal out of it at all, just labeled it as a dirty old man and don't let him do that. And so my mom, interestingly enough, all these years later, she goes, I realized that could have turned into a pretty traumatic event that carried me around forever. But because my mom made me just be like, no big deal, he's just a dirty old guy, my mom never attached to it as if it was a trauma. Now, for me, that's traumatic just hearing that story from my mom. But for whatever reason, we do have to admit there's power in the fact that she never psychologically attached to that in a way. And then the argument would be, some people might be like, well, that was still a wound and it still follows her around. And I just don't know that that's the case. My mom had, my mom's wounds were mainly around her mother, but my mom doesn't label herself as being sexually abused ever, even though some of us might label that. And I tell that story, as disturbing as it is, to just bring to mind this idea that we humans, our major superpower is the ability to make meaning or not make meaning out of things. We can choose the meaning that our suffering has. And so this is something that I think is important to begin this discussion and just to kind of get us to think outside the box. So I wonder what you would think about that, Justin. Would you say, oh, she was indeed, that's definitely trauma, it's stuck in her brain, or would you say, no, there actually is power in her attaching to it in a particular way or not?
Yeah, it's a great question because I
that's my little puppy getting mad at someone at the door. Okay, Stoey, we see you. We hear you.
What I tell people is if you have doubt, just look at the body's message, the symptoms, the posture, the behaviors, all that gives the truth away. And that's why I say we don't need to kind of logically try to break it down and say, was it traumatic or not? Because we get debate about it. You might say it is, I may say it isn't. And your body decides for you. And that's really where the truth lies, because, you see somebody with PTSD and what happens? Did they get over the trauma or not? Well, if they're collapsed and shut down, and their posture gives away a lot, and how they behave in the world, and whatever coping responses and behaviors, you have to really analyze that part, I think, and see what it looks like, because that really gives the truth away. And that's all I tell people, is to say, let's look at this and see your behaviors. Are you type A? Are you type C? Are you, whatever that might be, addictions, compulsive habits. And that will lead you to the truth. And then it's just about getting honest with it. That's honestly, for me, the best way to look.
Yeah, I actually look at it the exact same way. I think I'm not surprised we agree on this, even though you and I haven't talked about this. I oftentimes say, look at your repeated patterns, your recurrent obstacles, and your stuck emotions. And those are going to point you into the stories that you wrote. Because here's the thing with our suffering and wounds. Something happens, and then we create a story. And then that story follows around as fate. And actually, Carl Jung has a great quote on this. If you don't make the unconscious conscious, it will follow you around and you'll call it fate. And in that example I gave of my mom, I think what happened is something happened. She created a story. And the story she created was kind of a no big deal story, just a dirty old man story, not an I was abused story. But to your point, we have to go, okay, well, what were her recurrent obstacles, stuck emotions, and repeated patterns? If she ended up having dysfunction, sexual dysfunction, perhaps, or issues with male romantic partners, or those kinds of things, we might say, okay, well, that definitely had an impact, because that's your behaviors and your patterns are going to tell you a little bit about this. And let me just explain a little bit about this so you all listening can follow this. I like to think of it like when I was a kid in elementary school, I would sometimes find a string or a piece of yarn on the ground at school, and I'd pick it up, and it would just be a long string, and I'd tie a knot in that string. And then I'd tie another knot on top of that knot and another knot until I had this big ball of knotted yarn, right? And to me, this is partly like what happens when we run into wounds and suffering as kids. What happens is we tie a knot, which is to say we write a story about what this means about the world. And that initial knot then acts as what I would call a seed story that determines how we perceive other things in our lives. And it leads to recurrent patterns, stuck emotions, recurrent obstacles. So when Justin says your body sort of keeps the score, so to speak, and actually that's a title of a book on trauma, that your body sort of keeps the score. I oftentimes think it's your emotions that keep the score. So like, the stuck emotion would be, are you angry all the time? Do you have frustration? Do you have resistance? Do you have anxiety all the time? Do you have this gnawing sort of depression, lack of trust or hope? Is there this gnawing insecurity, and has that followed you around? Then that might mean you tied a knot, wrote a story early on in your life that is now following you around because of these wounds and these traumas. And I think from your point of view, Justin, I agree. I think that we have to look and we just go, it's not what you think happened really all the time. It's how your body is relating to what happened. And sometimes your body's relating in a way that you don't even remember the story you wrote because you were too young and too unconscious at the time. We don't become fully conscious till about 6 to 10 years old. Our brain isn't fully developed until 25 years old. And so I think this is what you're getting at, and just add whatever you want there. But I think this is an important discussion, and then we can get into sort of how we find safety once again and all that kind of stuff.
It's really tough, especially because a lot of the trauma for us, I think the lowercase t trauma that you were alluding to earlier, happens in early infancy, 2, 3, 4, 5 years old. I don't know if I told you this, but I have a client who is 10 years old, and I'm working with her mom, of course, but she went through a major traumatic episode when she was 10 months old, like basically almost were killed by somebody. And how does a 10-year-old get ulcerative colitis, an autoimmune disease, right? And we, her mom and I were both kind of speculating that intuitively I felt that experience probably left some indelible mark on her nervous system and did something. But at 10 years old, do you remember that trauma or that event? No. And so that's the point, is like a lot of us are walking around and behaving and have these coping responses and don't realize that it's tied to something early on because it's out of our memory, like you said. And that's what's really difficult about it, because if we can't remember it because of trauma itself, disrupting the brain and the hippocampus and those things, or it's just too early on in life, then we can't make sense of it. We can't really have this discussion very well. It's just really difficult. And so that's why I think it takes a lot of different angles and approaches and deep introspection and narrative medicine, these sort of things. It's to try to have an open-minded view about it to see what could be, kind of hiding in the shadows. That's the only way I can kind of look at it.
Yeah. And I think for you, the listener, if you're wondering, like, does a 10-year-old remember this? Certainly. And here's something before we move on to sort of how to address some of this. Here's something to understand about this. Certainly, maybe a 10-year-old does, but what happens is usually it's an emotional memory, and emotion doesn't happen with logic. And so what we know about how we form memories is they're very fragmented in early life. And so, typically we talk about 0 to 10 years old. Consciousness is somewhat fragmented. Really, we don't start even relating to ourselves as separate from other people until about 6 to 10. They say we don't start forming full memories in the way that we normally think of an adult does until 4. It's pretty fragmented. And so what we need to understand is that what we're really talking about here is the ability to logic our way around something that's happened versus our nervous system or our unconscious, which essentially doesn't think in logic, right? It thinks in feeling, it thinks in metaphor, it thinks in symbol. And so this is partly what happens as people grow up. They have these stuck emotions that you can't logic your way around. They're there. They're in the nervous system. They've had an impact on the nervous system, but logically you don't necessarily know what that's about. And this is what Justin's alluding to here. You can't necessarily logic your way into this, which does then call into question talk therapy in general, which is a very logical process for a lot of people versus other processes that allow you to get into the emotional feeling state. Things like written exposure therapy, things like a meditation, things like a visualization that get you into a more feeling sense and the unconscious sort of awareness. And Just in case that's not clear, consciously we think in language and we think in logic. Unconsciously, we don't communicate that way. So the way your unconscious is going to communicate with you is through symbol, through repeated patterns, through recurrent obstacles, through stuck emotions, right? And so we have to unpack that in a sense and think differently. Just because you don't think there was a wound, or just because you think logically you dealt with it, doesn't mean the nervous system and the unconscious has dealt with it. And this is partly what Justin is alluding to. And there are ways, and I would say, and Justin might disagree with me here, but I would say we're not in a place in my mind yet with this work where we have a lot of evidence-based stuff that we know works, but there is evidence around story editing and written exposure therapy with traumatic events like PTSD. There is stuff around hypnosis. We certainly now know the psychedelic space, which again gets you very much tapped into your unconscious and what some people might call collective conscious. But we don't really have a whole lot yet that is evidence-based that allows us to unpack this stuff, even though people are talking about it as if we do. And so I guess what I would ask you is, do you agree with that, Justin? And, when we're dealing with these kinds of things, and the listener who's listening to us right now, they're going to want to know, okay, fine, you're saying there's a connection between, early traumatic wounds that are impacting us on an unconscious level that then impact the nervous system, which then impacts the immune system and all of that. But how do we actually deal with this, right? Because I don't think you can just take some supplements and deal with this. So even though we might be able to describe it mechanistically, a big pet peeve of mine in natural medicine in general is people talk about mechanism all day long, but they don't really have any real viable tools that actually work to unpack this. So what would you say? Is some of the evidence, some of the things I'm aware of: somatic therapy, written exposure therapy, meditation. What else?
Somatic sensory experiencing, and I honestly, neurofeedback is pretty hot right now. It's been difficult to get research around it, but that's been showing a lot of promise. But it's all.
And by neurofeedback, what do you mean? Like, what kind of therapies would this be? Like looking at HRV or heart rate on a monitor and trying to consciously bring it down. Like that's
it's all about regulating the brain, and they have you hooked up to like a video game, and you kind of just I forget exactly how it works. It's quite detailed.
I know we have things like EMDR too, and there's definitely therapies.
Yeah, I mean, there's evidence around EMDR for sure. There's research around neurofeedback. There's research around, expressive arts is something I like to do personally a lot because of what we're talking about here about getting to the body and not getting out of the head. Mm-hmm. Because a lot of our memories, like you said, it's like implicit memory, as we call it, right? So they're stored in the senses. The somatosensory nature of trauma is stored in the body, but like the sound, smell, the sight, the texture, the color, right? Those things we can recall. And a lot of clients I work with even have just memory of those things. And like you said, fragmented memories of that, but don't have a cohesive narrative of like what happened on a chronological order. It's broken up. They remember parts of it, right? But that's what trauma does. It really disrupts the brain. And then, parts of the brain that are responsible for language, right? Like the Broca's area, I think. And then how can you talk your way out of trauma? How can you talk about it if you can't even, right? So that's obviously everyone's different with that, but that's my gripe with it too, is that how conventional psychotherapy is a lot of limitation because of things like this.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And what I would say is let's get into, I want to go through a mechanism really quickly that Justin had told me to cover. So we'll do that. I'll give him a chance to comment on it. And then we'll talk about some of the therapies that I am using and Justin's using in this space. But the first thing I think to understand is, so if you're someone who's like, well, I don't know if I've fully dealt with my suffering. And what I'm going to say right here is going to be somewhat triggering. So forgive me here, but it needs to be said. Part of the way I look at this is that when people go through suffering, especially when we're young and we can't be logical about it, we will, oftentimes depending on where we are in our development, we will get stuck there. So childhood, if it happens in childhood, this is a time of safety and security needs that need to be met. And so when we have suffering, wounds, capital T traumas at this time, we oftentimes can have safety and security concerns that are arrested. We don't get to fully develop feeling safe and secure. And how that can manifest is a threat response. We oftentimes will see fight, flight, freeze, fawn responses. And so what I mean by that is you'll have a kind of base level behaviors where, hurt people hurt people. This would be a child who had a wound when they were young, who have some safety and security concerns, and as a result, fight or try to hurt people because they were hurt, versus maybe the fawn response where someone develops a people-pleasing tendency because they were hurt in their childhood, versus the freeze response or the flight response where you get an avoidant personality or a personality that ghosts people and that kind of thing. And so when you see these kinds of behaviors in yourself or other people, doesn't mean it's always the case, but you want to ask, did something happen in childhood that was a safety and security concern that led to fight, flight, freeze, or fawn responses? People pleasing, aggressive behavior, avoidant behavior, anxious behavior, all of these kinds of things. Now, in adolescence, we look at acceptance and belonging issues. And so people who, had trauma in adolescence oftentimes will have things around insecurity, around acceptance, around popularity, around authenticity, around feelings of unworthiness and self-worthiness and insecurities and things like that. And in early adulthood and adulthood, that often has a lot to do with autonomy and self-determination and the ability to feel like we can make our own choices and freedom. So we can, to some degree, based on where these traumas happen in development, we can begin to see. And of course, if you listen to my work, the child wound, I talk about base level behavior. The adolescent wound, I talk about culture level behavior. And of course, what we're after is next level human behavior, which in my mind is to essentially make new meaning out of the wound. So yeah, you had a wound, you were suffering. Rather than getting all involved with it and be like, I have a wound, and this is the triggering part, which I would call a victim mentality. And I do think the triggering part is calling it a victim. Now, I think every human needs to and should be and is required to be a victim for a time. But the triggering part that you might not like is that at some point, being a victim is a choice. At some point, you have got to stop living in victim. And to me, that's the next level human behavior. So I'm going to stop and see what Justin has to say, and then we can talk about safety, security.
Well, I was just going to say, I said this too. I mean, what if everybody in the world was a victim? We would, as a society, we would just fall apart, right? Mm-hmm. We can't all afford to do that, right? It's not next level human behavior, is it?
Yeah. So, and what's a human, by the way, that's been hurt, that hurts people? That's a villain. Yeah. What's a human that's been hurt that identifies and keeps that identity? That's a victim. And what's a human who has been hurt but chooses to help people? That's a hero. Mm-hmm. And we do all have those choices. So are you going to be the villain, the victim, or the victor/hero? Yeah. That's a choice we all have.
Yeah, I know some people don't like hearing that, but yeah, I listen, myself included, we have that sort of victim mentality. We kind of wallow in our own pain and suffering. And, I've been there. You see me through that, I think. But eventually, you once you start to figure out who you are and what you want to do in this world and what impact you want to make, then you do have a choice. And you always have a choice, but I think you have to actually kind of find that path. And it takes some time. I mean, it's not like an overnight thing where you can just become, you feel a victim, then you decide, okay, I'm ready to be better and be my next best self. It takes a minute, but we can all do it.
And I would say the mechanism, by the way, let's go through one of these mechanisms. And it does have to do with polyvagal theory. For those of you who know, you don't need to know, but I describe it a little bit different. The idea here is that if you are stuck in threat response, you can kind of think of these like a light switch, right? So imagine 3 light switches on your wall. And whenever you hit one light switch, the other 2 automatically go off. So only one can be on at a time, right? And what happens with these light switches, this nervous system, is that we are either the light switch for threat is on. And if the light switch for threat is on, that means the light switch for being safe and secure and rest and recovery is off. Now, Also, you can have a light switch for striving that goes on, right? And this would be the threat response is the safety, security needs of the child. The striving response is the acceptance and belonging needs of the adolescent. Now, most people in our culture are either in threat response and have that light switch on, or they're in striving response and have that light switch on. Part of this is just cultural, influence, and a lot of it has to do with these wounds. What we need, though, is we need to be able to turn those switches down so that we can move into safeness. We need to get out of threat and striving and get into safeness. And the example I like to use here, if you can imagine, if me and Justin are on the plains of Africa, and you listener, let's just say the three of us are on the plains of Africa and we see a lion in front of us. That's a threat response, right? We see the lion. We know we're going to have to do something, fight, flight, freeze, whatever. We are under threat. Now, if the lion goes away, but we're still on the plains of Africa, we're in a striving response because we might have safety. The lion's not there right now, but we don't have safeness because we're still on the plains of Africa and we still have to watch out for that lion coming back. The safeness response is getting in a house, being in a protective place where we can actually stop looking around and the lion's not going to show up in our house. We're safe now. And that's what people don't understand. There's a threat response, there's a safety response, and then there's a safeness response. And in order for us to heal and repair and regenerate, we need the light switch for safeness to go on. And many people, when they have wounds and when they are under trauma and when they've had these responses, cannot switch off the threat and striving response to turn on the safeness response. And this is a big piece of what Justin and I essentially are working with a lot of people, and they don't necessarily know. And so I don't know what your thoughts are on that, Justin, but I think it's important for people to understand this. And I think this analogy with the lion helps people understand, yeah, you're right. I can have safety, meaning the lion's not going to eat me right now. But if I think the lion potentially is going to come back, I have to be hyper vigilant that it's going to show back up. Now, tell me that doesn't relate to relationships and job stress and all this kind of stuff. Of course it does. And if you don't have the ability to get safe, you can't repair, rest, and regenerate. And if you can't repair, rest, and regenerate, then you're using up resources constantly, even if we're going to talk about it from vitamins, minerals, and everything else, and eventually your body's going to get sick.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's actually to the point of what we said earlier. If you're not in safeness, you're in threat or striving or drive mode. And that's relating to the personality traits and the coping patterns. And if you need to get truth behind whether or not you have trauma to work through, there you go. Right. That's really how I look at it, is because it takes, you have to dissolve all that. You have to really learn how to disengage from that in order to fully embrace safeness. But that's really where the work is.
Yeah, and one of the things I'll point out here that Justin, I think, oftentimes gets grief from when he posts a lot of his stuff is some people will, he talks a little bit about, and there is research, correct me if I'm wrong on this, Justin, but there is research, for example, type A personalities. We all know what that personality is, the sort of control freak, hard driving, always has to get stuff done, always has to be working. There is at least population studies looking at the correlation between type A personalities and autoimmune and immune conditions. And also you can relate this to the need to over-exercise, the need to control your diet and your food and all these things. And so it's not saying you're wrong because of these things. It's just saying if you really want to get to the bottom of this, remember, it's an unconscious response. You can't logic your way to this understanding. So then you have to look at your repeated patterns, your recurrent obstacles, your stuck emotions. That's what Justin's alluding to here. And the data, at least from a correlation perspective, is there to show us that this is absolutely related. And when we look at things like polyvagal theory and some of these other things, which again, there's some controversy around that science, but to me, it just becomes self-evident. Let's get into, as we wrap up, let's get into how to begin to deal with this. And I'll start us off and then I'll let Justin sort of jump in. So from my perspective, and I'll tell you a story that I think will drive this home because stories are always helpful. So when I was writing one of my books, the Next Level Human book, which still hasn't been released, this is back in 2019, I started writing a story about my mom. Now, many of you who are listeners of this podcast know I have a mother trauma. My mom is my best friend. She also is one of my greatest teachers and was one of the more difficult wounds that I had to overcome as an adult male. Anyway, I'm writing a story about her in this book, and I began to feel, and I'm not someone who typically cries very easily, but I began to feel as I was writing this story, this emotion began to come up, and I set my computer aside and basically just wept, like literally wept. Like I don't think I've ever wept in my life. I was at a hotel room in Vegas. Anyone who walked by that hotel room would have thought someone was dying. That's how hard I was crying. And that release from that writing was such a powerful response. It actually caused me to really delve into the research on writing and things like written. And what I uncovered is just a huge body of research on what is called story editing, writing about your wounds. The most important one is written exposure therapy, or WET. I like the idea of WET because it's kind of like getting in the shower and rinsing off your emotional wounds. Written exposure therapy. And it works like this. Basically what you do, and this goes to some of what Justin was educating us on. The first part is to tell what happened. Now you got to be careful here though, because if you look at the research, you don't want to tell it from a logical perspective. First of all, because of what Justin educated us on, those memories are going to be fragmented anyway in any trauma, especially if it's a younger trauma. And so, but what you want to do is you will get into the feeling of it. So you want to get into the feeling. How do you get into the feeling? Well, you talk about, where's the feeling in my body? What's the personality of the feeling? Because remember, we're talking metaphor, we're talking emotion. This isn't a logical. You can't describe a feeling the way that we think. You have to describe it in metaphor. So you give it a texture. Is it sticky? Is it spiky? Is it slimy? Like, what's it like? What color is it? Is it dark? Is it bright? Is it blinding? Right? What temperature is it? Is it hot or cold? Where does it sit in our body? Really, what we're trying to do is describe this feeling we had and the personality of it. So I can tell you very clearly, the personality of my mother wound feels like a thick piece of tar that goes from my throat down to my solar plexus and sits there in a very heavy, sticky way. And I know that personality. So the first part of writing is to describe what it feels like. Why is this important? Because then when, like Justin says, when we encounter things in our daily lives that are threat-based and we feel that same feeling again, we can relate and go, oh, I felt that before. I know what that's from. And this is what gives us, the ability to begin to tap into where this is in our body. The second part of written exposure therapy, at least the way I do it, is to say, what story did I write? What did I make that mean about the world? What I made it mean is female emotions are not predictable and not safe. And I don't trust women, among other things. And then the final part of this is to write what you will make it mean going forward, right? Which for me, I ended up teaching mainly women my entire life. And I didn't figure out that, I could make meaning out of that. And so written exposure therapy is a way to see and understand where the wound is in the body, see and understand the story you wrote, for better or for worse, and see and understand how you can make a new story that turns you into the hero. So that's written exposure therapy. And I want to see what Justin, any other techniques you have or your thoughts on that or anything that I missed.
Yeah, I mean, it's very identical to what I first learned when I was learning all this stuff with my mentors and therapists about what they call it, narrative medicine. Mm-hmm. And it's probably very similar, but it was really just like, hey, tell me your story, what happened to you? And from an objective standpoint, but yes, you don't remember everything. And a lot of people actually can't even write. And this is where I actually have seen this happen, where written exposure therapy or narrative medicine actually backfires and isn't suitable for some people because it can be re-traumatizing for some people. It's rare, I think, but it's definitely an important tool we have. You know, one thing that you mentioned, which I really like, and where I think ties into expressive arts, is how when you get familiar with that emotion and you give it texture and a description and you get into symbol and metaphors, like you said, it's really, I do this all the time, even with myself. You can literally draw and illustrate that on paper and other mediums as well, but that gives it more, brings it more to life. And I'll do that with people who can't find the words to describe it, their experience. You know, that if the language part is shut down, the prefrontal cortex isn't working very well, right? How are we going to talk about it? So this is, another great way to communicate, because, you're communicating something whether you say it or not. And so through art and paint and drawing, sculpture, I've done these things. And
music.
Yeah, all that, right? And so it's a great way to communicate, and you don't have to really try to interpret it. It's not really the goal. The goal is to get it out, and then you can find meaning from that at some point. And through the conversation, the dialogue, interactions, you can start to figure out what it might be telling you and giving it a voice. A lot of times I'll say, what is this emotion saying to you if it had a voice, right? Aside from where does it reside in your body. So when you start to play with it in that way, it's less threatening. It's actually very self-regulating in and of itself. And it gives you a sense of self-mastery, which you may not have had before. And these are all little subtle things that help somebody move through this, because you get all these different benefits.
Yeah. And the other thing I'll say, which is really great you brought that up, Justin, is that everyone's a little different, right? Some of us are auditory. Some of us are very kinesthetic. Some of us are visual. And so when you're going through some of this stuff, you want to tap into that. And the research actually is pretty clear. If you start something like written exposure therapy too soon, it definitely can backfire. So I oftentimes talk about, like, just like with a physical wound, like if you twisted your ankle, you first need to feel it and stop doing what you're doing. That's the whole point of feeling, so that you can sit and pay attention. So the first part of any suffering or trauma is to sit and pay attention, not try to do anything with it. The next part is the deal phase, where you essentially like, okay, now I'm going to have to, maybe get my knee wrapped. I'm going to need to get crutches. I'm going to have to be gentle. And the last part is the heal phase, which is where the learning comes in. And the best thing is, okay, you twisted your ankle. That means I won't go run through a field full of potholes anymore. That's the lesson. We need to do the same thing with emotional trauma. The final thing I'll say, because it's a huge pet peeve of mine, and I just feel like medicine does this over and over again, and people who work with people do this over and over again. To me, I go, there's no point in us bringing up your old emotional suffering and wounds if we don't define for you your next level human future self, which is a different entity. I oftentimes say, people go, be authentic to yourself. And I'm just like, okay, be authentic to who though? Your child self, your adolescent self, your current self? No, you should be authentic to your future self. The problem is you're tethered to an identity that is attached to, whether you are aware of it or not, old wounds. So how do we tether ourselves to our superhero self, the one who took these wounds and this suffering and made it into purpose, used pain as a path to purpose? So the next stage after written exposure therapy, which is really the third part of written exposure therapy, goes, what am I going to do now? And we get very clear about writing out in both a logical way and in a feeling way who your superhero self is. And this is where meditation comes in, visualization and meditation, especially meditation that taps into a particular feeling. Gratitude is a great one, just as one that you can just borrow. The feeling of love is another, but ultimately you want to, do something that teaches your body a new memory, a new feeling. This is why meditation is so critical. You can't just do something like written exposure therapy. You can't just come with someone that says, oh, you've got a wound, and then they do nothing to help you become your future self and feel into something different. That's where meditation, from my perspective, comes in. And then the final technique that I use is something I call be it until you see it, which is essentially a technique where now that you understand your wound and you understand what you want to use it for, and you're meditating and feeling that feeling, now you got to act it out. You got to go out in the real world and be this hero. In other words, find people who have suffered the same pain and help them understand that pain and help them heal. And to me, this is the 3-part process. And it's also the feel, deal, and heal phase. You cannot heal from these things unless you understand who your future self is. And I would say any practitioner you're working with who is just intent on telling you all your past stuff and why you've got wounds and this and that, but has never spent any time helping you address and become your new future self, is probably somebody who, again, is not looking at this in a holistic perspective. What are your thoughts?
Well, I was thinking of a quote that I say a lot, and it's to the tune of, the process of change is not in becoming what you're not, but being where you are. And that doesn't mean you don't try to become your future best self, but that there is a part of this journey, like you were saying, where you have to actually sit with it and be where you are and feel it. And it's one of the biggest lessons I teach clients, because a lot of them are striving to get out of their disease or illness or trauma, whatever it is. And you got to be, obviously you have to take action, but it's all about the place of which you come, what intention and energy you have behind all that. Because the paradox is that when you learn to sit with these things and be with it, it's actually easier to move forward and, reach your self-actualize and reach your greatest potential. But it doesn't happen when you're really gripping on and you need to figure it out and find a solution.
Yeah.
Right. So you have to be patient with it. I think it's the point is that some people don't, I can tell you, some people just can't see a future of living a different way. They're just, all they know is this, where their current pain is. And it takes a lot of unburdening for that to happen, where they can finally say, okay, I can see that happening for me. It feels true. But a lot of times it feels contrived if they're too soon.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense. So we've been going about 45 minutes. I want to stop because I'm trying to make these podcasts a little bit shorter. But any final thoughts for you on this?
I was actually curious. I've heard you talk about this story in Vegas when you were writing. I remember that actually. But when you mentioned this about the tar, I didn't know this part from your you said your thyroid down to your sternum.
Yep.
Do you think, because for me, I just go, if that happened to somebody early on in their childhood, and maybe it holds true for you too, but the fact that this thyroid issue, Hashimoto's, you see, for me, I see these patterns where people have a lot of pain and they feel it in certain parts of the body. And a lot of them with Hashimoto's will say they had anger here or they had, grief, and it's like always around here and stuff. And it's just an interesting connection, but I wonder if you thought about that yourself.
I certainly am not ready to discount that, and I'm certainly not ready to say that that's truth. Right. But I also have seen that, and I think the more that we understand, my guess would be that that's absolutely a contributing factor, if not a causative factor. I just, you know me well, Justin, and I know you well. I don't want to say that, I won't go as far as saying, oh yeah, that's definitely the cause. But yeah, but the other thing I'll say about that, because I think a lot of people, my final thoughts on this, a lot of people go, okay, well, after that cry, did that tar feeling go away? Did you ever? And I look at it like this: I don't think you ever. And this might seem depressing to people, but I look at pain as a backpack. Every painful, suffering thing you have, it's basically a brick in your backpack. And you don't get to you don't ever get to take off that backpack. The issue is you're seeing it as bricks. When you can look in that backpack and instead of seeing them as bricks, you see them as tools. So now this feeling that I have in my, this kind of nauseous, thick, sticky tar feeling that I have as that wound is a reminder to me of what I'm here to learn and what I'm here to teach and how I'm here to love and heal people. I think we make a mistake when we go, oh, I'm just supposed to one day get rid of this and it's not going to be, something there. I go, the idea is not to get rid of something. The idea is to integrate it. So I do like to think about wearing this backpack, and I'm like, I'm always going to have this backpack on. That brick of pain is always going to be there, but I get to use it and decide to use it as a tool to help people or a weapon to bash people over the head with, right? And that's literally, I think, what we're doing. The whole point, perhaps, of pain is so that we could learn, teach, and love in a way and contribute to the world in a way that we couldn't otherwise. Who would we be without our pain, in a sense? Perhaps much less than we are. And to me, it's really about coming to terms with our pain and using our pain as a path to purpose, using our hurt as a way to help, using our suffering as a deep source of meaning. It's not to get rid of it. I'm not even sure that's possible.
It's not. It's nothing to get rid of. Just to be with it and learn from it, like you said, and integrate it into your life.
So where for people who don't know you, Justin, you've been on the podcast several times, but where do they find you?
Yeah, I talk about this all day, every day, because that's what I do. Yep. Trauma and autoimmune disease and those things. But if you find me on Instagram at Justin Janoska, you can hear more about it. And I have my own podcast too, where I talk a lot about these specific things. Actually, it's called Autoimmune Revolution Radio. Yeah, that's it.
And it's Janoska, Janoska.
Right.
So Justin at Justin Janoska, at Autoimmune Revolution or www.autoimmunerevolution.com. All right, everybody. Thanks so much for hanging out on the podcast. Hope you enjoyed this one. Justin and I certainly are passionate about this stuff. So hopefully it was educational, and we'll see you at the next show. You have been listening to the Next Level Human podcast with Dr. Jade Teta. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure you subscribe and consider leaving a review. You make the biggest difference when you pass on your lessons and inspire others. That's why reviews like this are so powerful. Your words may be the only ones that resonate for someone else. Please remember the information in this podcast is for educational purposes only. Always consult your personal physician or therapist before making any lifestyle changes. And finally, thank you for who you are in the world and the difference you make.